teaching a class on the Herald, which for people who may not know is a particular sort of improvisational style or structure that came out of Chicago. Did you want to chat about or explain what the Herald is or what it means to you? Because I know there's many different, I guess, ways people think about it or talk about it.
Yep. Yes. So the dates, the exact dates and all of that kind of stuff sometimes fly out of my head.
Yep.
But my understanding is that there was a group in San Francisco that were trying to put together a way of having all of the games that they were playing come together in a way that was more seamless. It was the 70s. So it was a really like, you know, kind of free for all time. And they were touring with this show, and they created a series of scenes and games that took about half hour, 40 minutes, and was completely improviser driven. And that was kind of the birth of long form. And it's, I think one of the main distinctions is that the players get a suggestion from the audience and then away they go. There's no MC that controls the flow of the action. And that's really what the experiment was all about. And then somebody on a bus at some point was saying, oh, what are we going to call it? And they were making a reference to the Beatles when one of the Beatles was asked, like, what's your haircut called? And so they just decided to name it the Herald. And I didn't even know that information for the longest time. And I would get confused and I would think it was Herald with an E, like that you're heralding, like you're blowing the trumpet before you make an offer or something. But no, it's called the Herald. And apparently in the community, there's been a lot of regrets about that particular title because it does absolutely nothing to inform you about what you're going to experience.
No.
So the good thing about that is that it's really open. It has developed.
Maybe you should start a campaign to call it the Herald, which might be a little bit more informative for people. So call it the
You know
Herald.
what? I got other things happening. It's really okay that it's called the Herald to me.
Yeah. Okay.
I have to pronounce it with a different vowel here in Australia, Harold.
Oh, okay.
In the States, it's called the Herald.
Oh, that is really close to the Herald.
It is.
So
It's actually the same
I see why
vowel.
you made a mistake. Yeah. Excellent. So how long have you been doing Heralds for? Like, how long have you been doing Heralds, practicing them?
Probably since I started doing improvisation. I was around a company in Minneapolis that had it was really fortuitous to be a part of the Brave New Workshop at the time I was, because the owners had just changed hands. So they changed hands from Dudley Riggs, who was like ex-circus performer, did a lot of improv, a lot of political satire improv. And the owners had gone to Chicago and they'd done heaps of different improv then, and they brought all that training back to the Brave New Workshop. And so we did some short form, although it was more scenes that had a hook. So there was a lot of scene work. And then the main stage company would use improvisation to write sketch comedy. And after the performance, every night they would do either a montage, which is, a looser long form where the scenes just flow from one to the next, or they would do a Herald. And so that's when I first saw them. And I was training with this company at the time. And it was interesting because I saw so many Heralds before I ever attempted to play one. And when I came to Brisbane and Brad Daniels and I started playing around with the Herald Club, it was difficult because there was no internet. It was back in the day before the interweb, with the teletype machine. Now, but the thing was, like, there was an internet, obviously, but there were no recordings of Herald. And so I was teaching the Herald in a vacuum. Nobody had any idea what I was talking about. I was trying to describe this. I know that's kind of gone on a bit of a tangent there.
No, it's great.
Yeah,
I love
so
improv
I
history.
fell in love with that form.
Yeah, excellent. And so I think what keeps you coming back to it? Like, what makes you love it? What makes you want to teach it?
I think there's the Herald has gone through a lot of different forms and is still growing. And there's contemporary Herald practice that I'm not in touch with at all. What I know is what I was trained to do. And that's like now referred to as a training Herald. And the training Herald is like a 3-act play. So it has an opening at the top, where the improvisers get a suggestion from the audience, they break it open to what's meaningful about that word to this particular group at this time. They try to break it open as widely as possible. Then they have 3 different scenes. They do a group game that's kind of like a palate cleanser that somehow harkens back to that theme that they're dealing with. And then they do 3 other scenes, and there's some callbacks and shelving. So there's these connections that are made. And they do another palate cleanser and another set of 3 scenes. It may be 3 scenes. It may only be 2 that morphs into then one scene that gathers a lot of these different elements together. So it's kind of like this beautiful V shape that there's all these different disparate, knocking my light, all these different disparate elements at the top. And then they ideally, like if the team is really connected and the planets are in alignment, it comes together in a really satisfying way at the end. And I think that's one of the things that's always kept me loving Herald play, is it takes a sort of being in the moment and really listening to everything. You can never be off. Like when you're off stage, you have to be listening all the time, because that's going to inform what you do. And you have to play organically. You can't try to control the narrative that happens, because it could go any which way. So it is absolutely a team sport. It takes the entire team and what the entire team is good at. All these individuals coming together, where some people might really have great narrative skills and can kind of hold the whole picture. Other people might be really great at relationships or character. There's a place for every skill set in the Herald and in a Herald team. And the times when I've played in Herald teams that are really well connected have been the most satisfying experiences of improv for me, because it's not just about having that connection just with one player or like a handful of players that I really, groove with. You can actually create that sense of rapport by training it.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so I hope that's not too wordy. And
No.
now, half an hour later.
Yeah. No, it's great. Look, I think if you were teaching improv and weren't passionate about it, then there'd be a worry. So that's great. I love it. So I thought I'd also just clarify, in case people aren't aware, I guess, the difference between long form and short form. So I think you briefly mentioned short form there. Short form is probably what a lot of people in Brisbane are familiar with, because I guess we were colonized, is the way to put it, by theatre sports. So that's where we got improvisation from Canada. And that sort of spread throughout Australia and New Zealand. And that's sort of been, I think, the culture here. And theatre sports is an MC, and we'll be given games or scene starts and people will perform them. And we do our own little bit weird version of theatre sports here as well, that I don't even think is quite different from the Canadian version. But yeah, so that's often what people, when they talk in improv, will often talk about short form, long form. And I think that's probably confusing to outsiders, but that's sort of what they mean, the difference. And I come from.
Did you want me to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do remember that date that theatre sports hit Australia in 1983, and it is the major reason why there's such a strong Johnstonian theatre sports influence, and that most people think of. If I ask a class, do you know what improvisation is? I don't get very many hands, but if I ask them, do you know what theatre sports is? I get a large show of hands. And then if I ask them, do you know who Keith Johnstone is? At least half, if not more, of those people put their hands down. So that's what's interesting. I think in Australia, to a certain extent, maybe because of school and the prominence of theatre sports in schools, that it's kind of separated from Keith Johnstone, which is really interesting. I think in a really simple way to put it is that Chicago style, like what we call Chicago style long form, which is actually done all over the world, but what we term it here, that in Brisbane, is has in its history has Viola Spolin. And what Spolin was really wanting to do was play around with this sense of intuition and experiencing stuff in the moment and creating stuff organically in the moment. So that whole aesthetic is what drives the Herald for the most part. And what Johnston wanted to do was to create good storytellers and then put them in improvisation. So a lot of the training, from my perspective, and I haven't trained extensively in Johnston, that's my perspective on just the differences that sort of back those things. So it's a little bit different approach. Of course, like today there's all kinds of melding and, coming together. And for a student, I think sometimes it can be a little bit confusing because of that melding. Some of those things are actually a little contradictory. You can hear one thing from one teacher that's exactly the opposite from another teacher. And that's simply because they come from a different training lineage. And many, many people are not purists. They just mix, a whole bunch of stuff together. So, I play like that as well. And I also definitely come from, especially with the Herald training, I come from that point of view of being in the moment and experiencing and tapping into a subconscious kind of group mind, because that's where things get weird. And that's where things are really satisfying to me as well.
Yeah,
that is such a long answer. The difference between long form and short form is that short form has an MC and hooks to jump through, and long form is more about the improvisers making it up.
Yeah, look, I think we could probably get into a discussion on that. That'll probably go for hours, and perhaps we'll avoid it. I think what I have found interesting, because I agree with you that I think a lot of improv training is a melange of stuff that kind of people turn into a big sausage. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I do agree that sometimes along the way, the purpose of activities is lost. And also you do end up with contradictory ideas. So people will take sort of Viola Spolin ideas like who, what, where into Keith Johnston, into his platform ideas. And I think if you sort of engage with his work, I think he very much disagrees with that approach. And so I think a lot is lost along the way sometimes when you kind of array everything together. And that's why I really love teaching from a tradition, because I think you understand the ideas and the values and the approach of that tradition, and it all makes a bit more sense. And that's why it's nice to go, no, this is just about, Harold's or Chicago style, if I'm going to put them in a little box. Or, this is very much Keith Johnston. And then once you understand those traditions as a performer, I think you can then bring them together and use them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But I certainly like to keep them a little bit distinct as much. You're not distinct,
because they're just clear. They're different ways in, really. Like they're just, it's not like you end up at the same place necessarily, but they're like, I don't know, to use a gardening metaphor. It's like you either have to choose, you're gonna like use the shovel or you're gonna use the rake, like what tool are you gonna use? I don't know. That's not a good metaphor at all, but you know what I mean.
Look, we'll edit that one out in post, I guess, maybe. The other thing I was going to say, though, is I actually think from having engaged probably more with Viola Spolin's work, which people, I guess, can look up if they want to, and Keith Johnston's, is I think there is both of them have a very strong focus on, I think, that being in the moment, being subconscious. I actually think probably to Keith Johnston's horror that a lot of his work gets turned into light entertainment. So, there's a game and a hoop you have to jump through. And I don't know that's what his work really is about. And like an entire chapter of his book is about trance masks, which there's nothing but that's being purely in the moment. So and certainly having trained with him a little bit, I'm not going to claim that sort of an acolyte, but he was very much about getting you so that you are not censoring yourself, not second guessing, not planning. So I think there's actually a lot between the two traditions that people can learn. I think that's what I love about it as well, is I think they actually do reinforce you, and they both give you just a different perspective on the same issue. I'm going to challenge you. I did some questions up about Del Close, who is credited as the creator of the Herald. So, and I was going to test you on your Del Close knowledge, just to see how much of a Del Close and Herald expert you are, or if you are conning us and are a giant fraud. So
both of those are true. And it might not be about conning, it's more about memory.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go with giant fraud, but you can say memory. They should be, look, we'll see. They could be too easy. I don't know. So, I find that improv trivia...
He was a man that lived.
Yes. Sometimes improv trivia is either too easy or just too obscure because of, I guess, the nature of the people who do it. They're not super famous. Okay, so what is the name of Del's long-term business partner and collaborator?
Charna Halpern, who I also believe should be credited with the creation of the Herald. I actually have trained with Charna.
Oh, okay,
she's quite, she's quite the force. And Yeah, she kept IO running for a long time.
Mm.
And I think it was also her that kind of said, we need to rein this thing in because it's too weird in 70s and make it a little bit easier to chew on.
To
So
digest for
yeah,
an
Charna.
audience. So she made it marketable. Yes. And
I believe so.
I for many years thought she was his wife, but I listened to a
Mm.
podcast and she was very firm in establishing that they were absolutely not in any way romantically connected, based on the fact that he did not have many teeth. So, secondly, this one, I think you've probably already answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. True or false? Dell named his and Charna's format, the Harold, after his favorite high school drama teacher called Harold.
No.
Yeah, excellent.
False.
Cool. False. Okay. And finally, what happens
was it
sorry.
Are you going to tell me what I got right or wrong at the end? Okay. I got
Yeah,
you.
no, you were right. Sorry, you were right. I think you answered that earlier. What happened to Dell's skull on his death?
Oh God, I read this. He freaking donated it. He wanted to donate it. Oh yes, he wanted to donate it to one of the theaters in Chicago that does Shakespeare, so it could be used on stage for Hamlet. But there was like this whole thing about it where they couldn't because it was like a real skull, and that's a problem. It has a prop. I don't know. It's this whole mess. That's all I know.
He did want it donated to the Goodman Theatre in Chicago.
Yes,
and
that's right.
Charna did apparently try to get it removed, but apparently getting your skull removed from the corpse is not a thing that people do. So she ended up purchasing a skull from an anatomy supply company that do skulls for medical students and schools and doctors' offices. And apparently she tried to remove the teeth because he didn't have many teeth, but it's really hard to get a tooth out of a skull. So she ended up giving the skull to the theatre and saying, this is Dell's skull. But it came out a few years later because people realized that it had too many teeth, because he did have an ongoing history of substance abuse, I think. So he lost most of his teeth. So they actually figured out, because of the number of teeth the skull had, that it wasn't him. So
see,
yeah, I just
want to point out, Wade, that you've done a classic Harold move where you talked about the teeth earlier.
Yep.
As in terms of Charna's, not partnering with Dell, and then now you've brought it back full circle. So
yeah. I know how to shelve. That's my Keith Johnston term. Yeah. So
yes,
that's
right.
what we call it.
It's very similar.
Excellent. So finally, so in the Harold class, it's coming up in the end of May, and it's one of our advanced classes. But I guess why should people learn the Harold from you, Anne? Like, what do you bring to the table? That's very challenging, isn't it? Sorry.
Here's my table.
Yeah.
I'm gonna bring
nice
a salt and
there.
pepper shaker and an avocado to my table. I think I'm like I just love it. I love it, and so much of the way that I teach improv, the way that I approach improvisation, comes from the work that I've done with the Herald.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's really a culmination of everything that I do as an improv teacher.
And you've been teaching it for a long time, so this is something you've had a lot of experience with in the US, Minnesota.
Yeah. And I think it was really great for me as a teacher, even though it was hard to teach it when I first came to Brisbane in that vacuum, because I had to think very carefully about how to communicate what was important in the form and what was important in the way that people played, because they had no context and they couldn't look it up online. Nobody could see any examples of it online. So I had to really work hard as a teacher to think about it.
So I must admit, because when I came through, learning improv, it was sort of theatre sports or, different versions of it. And I think we ended up doing, ImproMafia does a lot of narrative, we call it sort of narrative long form. So sort of full length plays that have a story that flows through. I think there wasn't sort of any Harolds around in the 90s, or people didn't do that sort of work in Brisbane. So that was largely, my understanding then, is it sort of largely came out of your work then, sort of getting it established and sort of, I guess, popularizing it, to use that term, I guess, in Brisbane. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, one of the directors in Big Fork was a student of mine way back in the day, before I had my now teenager. So I took some time out of the community. Like I took some time off for quite a few years. But before then, when I was really active, it seemed like that's what happened to me, was that because, and Brad was really very much a part of that. It wasn't just
absolutely.
me. I don't want to just toot my own horn, but Edge Improv really had a lot to do with that, because Brad loved the Herald as well, and was really open to giving me a platform to teach it. And then we formed the Herald Club in the basement of Metro Arts, and people could get a beer at the Verve. And then we had that door that went between Metro Arts and the Verve open, so they could get their beer, come in and watch the show. And those were the first, sort of regular Herald experiences that people could lock into. So,
and I must admit, I'm going to confess here, I think I saw a version of the Herald in like the 90s. I think some American came out and did it in the back of a cafe, and I was not impressed at the time. I was like, oh, this is pretentious guff, and sort of walked away. It was unimpressed. But I think since then, I have performed in quite a few Heralds, and I have done a bit of training with people from that tradition. And I've grown, I think, in respect. I think like anything, it's what you make of it, as opposed to, it's not like the format is inherently bad or good. It's, how you approach it as a performer. Because theatre sports itself can be ridiculous and silly and stupid and, in a not fun way, if that's what you choose to make of it. So, excellent. And obviously I have changed because yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, obviously I have changed my view on the Herald, because I've been run lots of training on the Herald over the years. So, I guess I've
one of the things that I wanted to say was that we'll actually do a lot of Heralds in the class, like from day one. We'll do mini Heralds and then we'll work our way up. But it will not be talking about theory. There will be next to no talk about theory, maybe some. But it won't be talky. It'll be very practical.
And I think that's why we're running it as an advanced class, so that students can we're going to make sure that everyone who gets into class is sort of ready to do the work and is able to hit the ground running. So I think it'll be really good. And there's not many spots in the class, and we've already had a lot of interest. So I do encourage you, if people are interested, to register their interest, and that you can find that in the events on our Facebook page and get going from there. Cool. Well, I wanted to say a big thank you. This has probably gone on for a bit longer than even I expected, but that's what happens when improvisers start talking. They talk and talk and talk. But yeah, I wanted to say a big thank you for taking the time to chat today.
Well, thanks heaps for giving me the platform to explore, Wade, and I think it's going to be a blast. I love it.
Maybe you'll convert all of the hardcore theatre sporters to Heraldites before the end. So
there'll be some, then we'll just take the form in our own particular Australian way, and it'll be brilliant.
Excellent. Yeah, we can transform it, maybe merge the two and create a perfect union. A theatre, a Herald Sports. Yeah.
Theatre, Herald, dear.
Yeah, we'll work on the name. Name can be developed. Okay. Well, look, thank you. And if people have any interest, they can contact us on the ImproMafia page. Otherwise, find the Herald class event and you can register your interest. It is suitable if you are so you have some experience already in improv. So I wouldn't recommend it if you haven't done a beginner's class or a bit of training before. Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. And this has been Wade and Anne. Thank you so far.